Who do you resemble? A parent, a brother or a sister maybe, an aunt, an uncle or a cousin, maybe one of your grandparents. We had a very large family reunion recently, and it was wonderful to see the family resemblances and relatives I hadn't seen in decades, and some of them I hadn't ever met. But those characteristics were reflected through the generations. When my boys were young, a favorite game of theirs was called Guess Who? And for the uninitiated, the challenge of the game was to use the characteristics of the person to guess their identity. So, who do you resemble? We'll come back to that question shortly. Identity continues to be a really important theme in our lectionary readings. God says to Moses, "I know you by name." And Moses asked to continue to know God's favor, not only for himself, but for the people of God that have been delivered out of Egypt, a people who were to be distinct, to be marked as the Lord's, a people who would then come to sing God's praises in the words of the Psalms. And this question of identity carries through the encounters that Jesus has been having with the Jewish religious leaders. And we've tried to work out the identity puzzles in the parables of the last few weeks, the parable of the two sons, the parable of the vineyard, the parable of the wedding banquet, which were told by Jesus in response to the questions about his authority and identity on the part of the Jewish religious leadership. Jesus saw the Jewish religious leaders heading in the wrong direction, leading the Jewish people away from rather than closer to God. And he challenged their direction and authority through the parables we've heard recently. It's the beginning of the week following Jesus' triumphal entry into Jerusalem that we recall on Palm Sunday. The tables in the temple have been overturned, and to say the least, the Jewish authorities are not amused by his presence or his message. He continues to teach the people in the temple courts, and the chief priests and the elders have questioned his authority because they know his arguments are pointing to them. And the reading this morning is the beginning of what we could call their sort of counterattack against Jesus. In today's gospel, we have a particularly peculiar group assembled, disciples of the Pharisees and also Herodians. And that's particularly peculiar because Pharisees, being the most orthodox of Jews, would have been very resistant to giving any sort of support to the Roman occupiers by paying tribute or taxes. The Herodians, on the other hand, were the followers of Herod who owed his power to the Romans. But their mutual hatred of Jesus brought them together and outweighed their differences with one another. And they team up to confront Jesus. Although it doesn't really sound like much of a confrontation, does it? "Teacher, we know you are sincere and teach the way of God in accordance with the truth and show deference to no one. Tell us then what you think. Is it lawful to pay taxes to the emperor or not?" That sort of seems like a rather kind of mild question, but actually it's a life and death question. The wrong answer could be life-threatening. If Jesus said it was unlawful to pay the tax, he could have been reported to the Roman authorities and arrested. And a Galilean called Judas had led a revolt about paying the very tax, and he had paid for that with his life. It wasn't a sort of mild-mannered question. And this tax that they're talking about was payable by every man between the ages of 14 and 65 and every woman between the ages of 12 and 65. It was kind of a poll tax. And the amount payable per person was 1 denarius, this coin stamped with an image of the emperor and with words declaring his divinity. The coin itself was a sort of representation of Roman kingship and occupation. And because of the image and because of the words of divinity, any Jewish believer holding it was effectively breaking the second commandment. So to say that the tax should be paid, that the tribute should be paid, would be seen by the Jewish people as an insult to God, and that would discredit Jesus in their eyes. So it was a really clever confrontation. But Jesus isn't caught out by their scheme. He calls them on their hypocrisy, and then he asks to see the coin in question and is handed a denarius. That was also very clever of him because it makes those questioning him look hypocritical because they're the ones who had been carrying this coin that they weren't supposed to be carrying. And as he often did, Jesus poses a question. And in this instant, it's a question about identity. Whose head is this and whose title? And when they acknowledge that it is indeed the emperor's image, Jesus declares, "Give therefore to the emperor that which is the emperor's, and to God that which is God's." So Jesus manages to answer without being able to be condemned either as unorthodox or politically dangerous. And we have another example of Jesus really understanding the malice of those who were against him. And we see his ability to thwart their schemes. But what do these 7 verses have to say to us today? I think at the heart of this story is the reality with which every Christian lives. We have one foot in the kingdom of God and one foot in the world, and it's often a very uncomfortable place to be. Jesus seems to be saying, don't renege on your obligations as a citizen, but don't turn your back on God either. But how can we know what constitutes giving to the emperor that which is the emperor's and to God that which is God's? And is so often with Jesus and his teaching, he doesn't spell out the rules. He gives us principles to live by. And that makes it difficult because it's actually often a lot easier to have hard and fast rules rather than to be challenged to look to our conscience to be our guide. But I think it comes back to an issue of identity. Who do we resemble? Do we exhibit the characteristics of those who follow Jesus? How do we know if we aren't quite sure what it looks like to give to the emperor what is the emperor's and to give to God what is God's? There's a group that meets on Wednesday mornings to consider one of the Sunday lectionary readings, and this past Wednesday we were discussing this gospel, and we use a resource called Bible Workbench. And the resource we were using asked some pretty challenging questions, which I've been pondering since Wednesday, and I just wanted to share them with you today because for me, they're questions that get to the heart of my identity, not just who do I resemble, but whose I am. Where within me is one demanding tribute? What is the tax I must pay to live in peace with myself? What is the hypocrisy I believe, the bargain I make, the story I buy that keeps me willing to pay this inner one who has occupied me day in and day out? And now I'm going to reframe the same questions. Where within you is one demanding tribute? What is the tax you must pay to live at peace with yourself? What is the hypocrisy you believe, the bargain you make, the story you buy that keeps you willing to pay this inner one who has occupied you day in and day out? And for each of us, how does this tax show up? In that persistent backache, or the restless nights, or the twitch under the eye? By taking one more drink, or one more pill, or buying one more bauble? What might it take for us to see through the hypocrisy, call ourselves on it, and see whose image is on the coin? Who are we paying homage to in order to keep the peace, and at what cost? Whose are we? Do we belong to the emperor or to God? When we sang our psalm this morning, Psalm 99, we sang, "The Lord is King, a mighty King and lover of justice." We proclaim the greatness of the Lord our God. We have that opportunity each day in every aspect of our lives, at home, at school, at work, at the grocery store, on the sports field, to go out and live all that we sing and all that we say when we're together in this place, to show whose we are. How we do that will be affected by the decisions we make about how we distribute all that we are and all that we have, our time, our talent, our treasure. Does it go to God or to the emperor, whoever or whatever that authority over us might be? And those are not easy decisions. And they're not going to be the same for each one of us. And for each of us, they're going to be different at different ages and stages of our lives. But as I ponder those questions for myself, and as we ponder them together, I'd like us to call to mind these words of Jesus. "I have come that they might have life and have it abundantly." And as we say yes to that abundant life, as we say yes to our identity as the beloved of God, I hope then that we can pray as King David prayed, his prayer of praise. "All things come from you, O Lord, and of your own do we give you." Amen.